Good morning, everybody. Very happy to see so many people on this call. Let's start with this webinar organized by ecoDa and Ellen and Overy Shearman on the Corporate Sustainability Triple D Directive. I will be very brief because we have an hour together. I first would like to welcome the three excellent panelists, Axel de Bakker, Gauthier van Tuinen, and Jochem Spaans, all three very experienced partners in this area at this law firm. Myself, I'm Jeroen Hooyer. I'm an advisor of the board of ecoDa and a former EU official. Before we start, a few housekeeping points. First is that it would be interesting to have some questions during the session, but please use the Q&A function on the screen for that. I think you have been on many calls like this, so you know how it works. And I would also ask everybody to put their microphone on mute to improve the quality of this call. Now, on substance, I would like to stress that although many has been said about this directive, it has been a bumpy road to arrive here, but this morning we don't want to look back. We want to look forward. What does this mean? We want to be practical and as clear as possible. I know there are many board members on this call who are interested to see what it means for them, what they will have to do. So unless there are other questions, I would like to kick off with Axel and would like to ask you to give us a very brief explanation. What is this all about and where does the idea actually come from? Thank you, Axel.
Yes, of course. Like often when I talk to people who are not deeply focused on ESG and sustainability rules and regulation, and I mention the concept of sustainability due diligence, I get a lot of confused looks. Because when people hear due diligence, it's often more in an event-driven context, such as an M&A transaction or financing. But sustainability due diligence is really a very different beast. And what the concept covers is actually this integrated whole of policies and processes and procedures within your company or your group that allows you to identify adverse ESG impacts in your operation, also in your value chain, and then to action these, right, to mitigate these impacts, to prevent them, to remediate. And this is a concept that has been used in the past, but mostly in the context of, for example, human rights due diligence and responsible business conduct principles, which were developed, for example, at the level of the OECD. And these due diligence principles that were originally included in these soft law rules or these frameworks, they have now been effectively codified. They have become the law. And for me, the role of the board here is not so much to apply these detailed due diligence policies and procedures in the field, but really to ensure that these due diligence policies are developed in a sound manner that is what you could call fit for purpose for your specific company. And that really means as directors that you need to understand what the goal is of these rules so that you can also evaluate them. And the risk for directors with regard to sustainability due diligence really includes two important questions. Will you be able to demonstrate that the due diligence processes that you put in place were effective and fit for purpose? And afterwards, in the second phase, were you as directors ensuring that these policies and procedures were effectively applied? And that's for me really the bottom line.
Very clear. Thank you very much. And I think that it would, to move on this right away, be very interesting to understand what is left of this directive, because it has been watered down, as many people know, in the past. The scope has changed from rather small companies to bigger companies. Could you say a few things to explain to us where did we end up with the final scope of this instrument? Which companies are covered?
Yeah. So when we look at the CS3D and the proposal, the first proposal that was made by the Commission in 2022, there was immediately a bit of political backlash. The European Parliament adopted a different position than the Council, the member states adopting another counter proposal in 2023. And then you saw that there were really difficult political discussions, right, between Commission, Parliament, and the member states. And one of the key points was indeed, as you mentioned, the scope of the CS3 and the size of the companies that should be in scope. And In the provisional deal that was reached in December last year, the size was set at a certain point, but then in February, the member states they shut it down. They refused to approve this text. And the sticking point was that a number of member states, especially France and Germany, were pushing that a lot more companies should be out of scope. And where we ended up is that, and I'm going to talk about EU companies mainly, is you need to have a worldwide turnover of 450 million euro and 1,000 employees. And so that's very far away from the first proposal, which was a turnover of 150 million euros and 500 employees. And for example, France was actually pushing for a 5,000 employees threshold. And what we also lost in the eventual text is that the lower threshold for companies in high-risk sectors was dropped. I'm talking about textiles, agriculture, mining. So that's also dropped. So if you look at it very concretely, from approximately 16,000 companies in the EU in scope, we're now talking about fewer than 6,000 companies. So that's also a much smaller scope than the CSRD, because the CSRD, the Reporting Directive on Sustainability, that covers more than 50,000 companies in the EU. Now, what I mentioned is really focusing on, as I said, on the EU and EU companies. And there are some more nuances when you look at companies outside of the EU or companies that engage in very specific business models, such as franchising. So directors should really carefully consider whether or not their company is in scope or not.
Okay, very, very clear. I think it's important for the audience also to understand that there are really the big companies that are covered, the bigger companies. Maybe to move on now a bit more to the substance of the directive as such, and I come to Gauthier. Gauthier, could you, by way of introduction, run us through the main issues of the directive and what it entails? And what companies can expect to have to do, or board members have to do. You have a nice slide, I see that. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, if you draw very basically, so the short version, the directive has two sets of obligations. The one most important one, identify and address adverse impacts. So those adverse impacts relate to human rights and environmental issues as listed in an annex to the directive, along the company's chain of activities, which may include your own activities, but also activities by business partners. And when you come to the core measures, they're listed in this slide, that you have to comply with those measures, and that's actually integrating the diligence into the policies and your risk management as a company. Identify and assess and prioritize actual and potential impacts. So that includes actually stakeholder engagement. Seize, mitigate, prevent, and remediate potential adverse impact. Monitor your effectiveness. Establish reporting and complaint procedures, and communicate on what you've done. A bit along the lines of what Axel explained in the very beginning, make sure you have these policies and look at how effective they are. I want to say something already at this stage, and it will come back in later elements. The directive does not harmonize everything, and that is really important to understand. It is not as if you see those 6 core measures that, you know, as if I read the directive, I know what I have to do, because member states have a lot of power and a lot of leeway in this directive to go beyond certain requirements. But there is a number of core requirements that are identical, that need to be identically implemented in all of the member states. And that is indeed the obligation to identify and assess actual or potential adverse impacts, and to map and to actively assess what those impacts are, preventing and mitigating potential impacts, and bringing actual adverse impacts to an end, and provide remediation. Those rules are obligatory throughout the EU, but the measures that will need to be taken may be very different from country to country.
Super, thank you very much. To go on this, Gauthier, there is this concept of the value chain and later it has been changed, I think, to the chain of activities. This is mentioned a few times. Is there something to say about this from your view, as far as we know it today, what it means, and what it means in particular for the companies under this instrument? And I benefit right away of the fact that there's an interesting question, a bit technical, from Johan Barros about direct business partners and indirect business partners. He rightly says, we think we understand what it means, but are we sure what it means? If you can maybe cover this part.
Because let me start. So it is true. you indicate correctly, value chain of activities. This has been one of the major battlegrounds from the very start of the CS3D and the whole adoption process, together with also with scope and provision and liability. But it has been debated for a long time. And if you look at the directive, you'll still see in the considerations a reminiscence to that battle, because the considerations talk about value chain many times, but ultimately the compromise and the obligations have been focused around the notion of chain of activities. Now, if you look at what the definition of chain of activities is, it is the company's upstream business partners activities related to production of goods or provision of services by that company. And that includes design, extraction, sourcing, manufacture, transport, storage, supply of raw materials, products or parts of the products, and development of the product or the service. And on the other hand, downstream activities of business partners related to the distribution, the transport, the storage of the product, where the business partners carry out those activities. And already there I get confused, to be very honest, for the company or on behalf of the company. And there's a lot of questions on what that actually means. For instance, in the case of transport, when you're transporting for or on behalf of the company, that is one area that is not very clear. The binding concept therein is indeed the term business partner. That has been, again, something that was heavily debated. How can, or what the idea behind was that let's not try to limit the chain of activities per se, but look at the obligations that a company in scope of the CS3D has in relation to those chain of activities. And that depends on whether your business partner are a direct business partner or an indirect business partner. And I find it, to be very honest, also very difficult. I think I may understand, but I find it very difficult to apply it at this stage, because a direct business partner is an entity with which your company has a commercial agreement related to operations, products, or services of the company, or to which the company provides services in the chain of activities. And the indirect business partner is then, well, I like the definition. It's not a direct business partner, but it's a partner that performs business operations related to the operations, the products or services of the company. And so most likely the indirect business partners would then indeed be potentially the transporter or another company that you have no direct dealing with. But I don't find it very clear from the definition per se. So that is indeed a very important point that will need to be clarified later on. One final addition is that there has also been a lot of discussion on financial undertakings. And just for confirmation, regulated financial undertakings could fall within the scope, but their chain of activities includes only their own operations and their subs and the upstream part of their activities with their business partners, but not the downstream business partners that receive their services or products.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you. Very, very clear. And incidentally, I think you already covered a question from Caroline Turnbull, whether service providers are in the chain of activities. I think you said so.
They definitely are.
Yeah, but of course, to everybody here on the call will understand the proof of the pudding is in eating, as you say as well. There are some unknowns that need to be explained later, and there will maybe be also guidance from the Commission. We have to see. So not everything is 100% clear. If we move on this, because we're now really in the core of the directive, I think, of the due diligence requirements. Can you maybe say a little bit more about the internal processes that the company will have to foresee, and also, of course, the role of the not so much the management, but in particular the board overseeing this? Thank you.
Well, let's first look at what the directive says, and let's have a look maybe at two of the most imminent things that will need to be looked at as from a company point of view. Starting with identifying and assessing actual and potential adverse impacts. Here, the directive says, well, a company will have the duty to take appropriate measures to map your operations, those of your subsidiaries, and your business partners, direct and indirect, and make an assessment in light of the likelihood of the occurrence of an adverse impact and the severity of such an adverse impact. And as I said before, this part of the directive is harmonized, but what the appropriate measures are is not harmonized. And so the question is, how do you start as a company when you read this and all these great legal terms? I think what a company will need to do when they start is look at their materiality assessment, maybe not the same as for CSRD, but determine and rank the most material themes that are relevant for a business and on the basis of market data, on stakeholder interviews, on surveys, on contract management, and then map and engage and prioritize top supply chain relationships with who are the most strategic suppliers, who are the highest risks, which suppliers have or have not been audited, who's responsible for sustainability or ESG or any type of due diligence at your supplier. Is there a social compliance? Is there ESG sustainability risk assessment that you have done? Have you done audits? So what are the results thereof? And based on that huge mapping exercise, this in-depth assessment will then need to be performed. And that is actually for the start, because that is the first part of the directive, the identification and the assessment of the potential impacts. Very important, again, harmonized, but not when it comes to the appropriate measures. Harmonized is also the obligation to prevent, and if not possible, mitigate potential adverse impacts. And here, I think it's important to see that you do have these differences where they become very important in understanding what is a direct and an indirect business partner, because your obligations under this very important obligation to mitigate and prevent will depend on whether or not the measure that you wish to take depends on a potential adverse impact that is caused by the company, or it may be caused jointly by the company and a subsidiary or a business partner, or is it only caused by a company's business partner in the chain of activities. And it will also be different whether that potential adverse impact occurs in an activity or an operation of a direct or an indirect business partner. So it will be very important to get that concept straight, because it will determine the depth and the requirement and the rigor with which these requirements to mitigate and prevent will need to be implemented. And finally, a very difficult one is that's something you see in other areas in certain types of litigation against companies, is that the ability that a company has to influence their business partners actually may have an impact on the type of appropriate measures that a company may need to take. Now, the appropriate measures are not harmonized, but again, if you look at what the directive says in that respect, it says, well, maybe try to seek contractual assurances from your direct business partners. That's what the directive says, your direct business partners, not your indirect business partners, with whom it will be very much difficult to have those direct contract clauses you have. So you'll have to trickle them down in some kind of cascade. But also make financial or non-financial investments, make modification or improvements to your business plans, your strategies, your operations, support SMEs. And so it makes that the non-harmonized part, which is open to member states, will be very important. But the difficult part will always be indeed, how do I map correctly before I'm able to take my appropriate measures? And if you translate that to board obligation, I think, and Axel said the very right thing in the very beginning, I think this directive may require a number of obligations, but I would say also by and large, it is actually like for many other areas, the board, potentially also senior management, they will have a role to oversee and make sure that you understand what you're doing and make sure that you assess what the impact thereof is on the company's overall strategy. So typically what boards would probably want to do is clarify board and senior management roles and identify and clarify the processes surrounding the supply chain or the chain of activities due diligence. And that could include having committees or dedicated board members, or review to review the matters, the resource and disclosure, or set up sustainability working groups, define KPIs, to report to the board. So in a sense, the amount of work or the vastness of the work will probably be bigger than what you've seen so far. But I don't think essentially it's very much different from what Axel explained at the very beginning. I'm not saying it's easy, but I think that's really the point I want to make, actually.
Thank you very much for this excellent running through of the commitments. Personally, but maybe I'm a too simple Dutchman, I also think there's a lot of common sense behind this. As a company, depending on the industry or the sector in which you work, you know very well where the potential risks are. If you're in a textile industry, it's obvious there are issues about the labor side in the countries in which your products are produced. If you are in the health sector, I think you mentioned that, there are other risks on that, in which you have to zoom in probably as a company, and the questions that the board members have have to ask. That is more comment from my side. Maybe just, I see a question, several very interesting questions. I'm not sure we can cover them all, but one is actually, in the final version, there's no reference anymore to the remuneration of directors. Is that a loss, or do you think this can also be covered through other instruments or remunerations, for instance, under the Shareholder Rights Directive? Is there something, or one of the other members want to say about that?
You ask a political question to a lawyer who likes to hide in strict legal terms. That's actually a very difficult question. It has been one of those issues that was heavily debated, and I think I'll give an easy answer. There was so much opposition that at a certain point, I think potentially could have killed the directive for those who wanted to kill it. The issue of remuneration really has been a very hot topic. Is it a loss? It's not in there. I'm not sure. I mean, again, if you look at what the obligations of a board is, and every area actually, is to make sure that you know what you're doing and you know the impact on your business. Whether that needs to be translated into remuneration, that's probably a question that is not to be dealt with at EU level, especially given, I said before, the very, or not very, but reasonably limited scope of harmonization. So that is best left up to national traditions, national laws, national customs, rather than having some sort of, I don't know, EU type of intervention in that area.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to move on, and there is also a question on this, and it has to do on the interaction between this new directive and the CSRD. My guess is a number of the participants are now focusing on the corporate sustainability reporting directive and what they are supposed to do now, and setting up their internal frameworks and systems to report on that. And these substantial obligations will come later. But is there something to say already, and probably it's best for Axel to address, about how you see the interaction between these two directives with different scopes, etc.? Is there something already to say? Thank you.
Yes. I think on the substance, when we talk about the concept of due diligence under CSRD and CSDDD, it's pretty much aligned, right? In substance, we're talking about the same set of policies, processes, procedures with regard to ESG impacts. And I don't think that's a surprise, because all of these frameworks, they are built on existing frameworks, like I mentioned, like the OECD due diligence guidelines. But I think it's indeed relevant to clarify a bit the differences and maybe the interaction between CSRD and CSDDD. Now, CSRD, obviously, it's a reporting framework, right? It requires companies to report on sustainability matters, and that all has to be done in accordance with very prescriptive rules. Now, the first CSRD reports are already due next year for the large listed companies, and then in 2026 for the large unlisted companies. Now, as I already mentioned, a lot more companies are in scope of CSRD than are in scope of CSDDD. Essentially, if you're in scope of CSDDD, you will be in scope of CSRD. I think that's a bit like the general principle. Now, one of the things that the CSRD requires is that you assess ESG matters that are material to you, and either because you have a material impact on an ESG topic, or because certain ESG topics can have a material financial impact on you. That's the CSRD's double materiality principle. And it's really in this materiality assessment that you have to carry out where sustainability due diligence already comes in under the CSRD. And even though the CSRD, it does not impose a due diligence requirement, it does kind of heavily imply that you have to put these processes in place so that you are able to assess and report on ESG impacts. And also really crucially is that the CSRD already requires you to draw up detailed reporting on how you actually carry out sustainability due diligence. So the situation is a bit counterintuitive, because only a limited number of CSRD in scope companies are subject to the CSDDD, but actually all companies in scope of the CSRD, they have to disclose their due diligence processes and how it informs their CSRD reporting. And what it means for boards, and again, I must stress that the CSRD will apply a lot earlier than the CSDDD. First, I think it's expected that the CSRD reporting without due diligence processes will be scrutinized very critically by stakeholders. And it can definitely lead to arguments of your CSRD reporting being defective, not meeting the CSRD requirement. So As a board member, when you're discussing CSRD reporting, I really do recommend that you ensure that you're also scrutinizing the underlying processes, such as the materiality assessment and the due diligence processes that you have to put in place. And then secondly, once the CS3D is in place and you're in scope, I think you have to be very much aware that in your CSRD reporting, you will have to report in great detail how you actually apply and implement the CS3D. And that means that stakeholders, shareholders, but also NGOs, activist NGOs, but also supervisors, will immediately have a very clear view on how you are complying with the CS3D. And very importantly, they will also be able to benchmark you. They can benchmark you against your peers. And that, I think, will make CS3D compliance an even more sensitive topic, that interaction with the CSR.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Maybe I see a couple of questions on the Q&A, a few questions about the representativity of our panel, the gender balance. I cannot change myself now on the spot, but it is definitely something, it's a good remark. I have to think about it, we'll discuss it. As a matter of fact, we did have a female candidate who at the last moment could not come, but it's something to look into it next time. Of course, this is not done with any strange mindset. It happened as it happened, but we will take note of that comment. Maybe on substance, there is an important obligation for, I think, only large companies to work on a climate transition plan that they have to set up. And there has been a lot of debate about this. It is in the context of the Paris COP agreement. At the same moment, it's probably very complicated for companies to do this, but they have time. So Jochem, maybe it would be nice if you can run us a bit through this and help us to understand what it means and what companies are supposed to do. Thank you.
Yeah, sure, Jeroen. And let me start by briefly explaining what a transition plan actually is. In essence, such a plan aims to ensure that the business model and the strategy of the company are compatible with the transition to a sustainable economy, which means you must be compatible with limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, as per the Paris Agreement, and with the objective of achieving climate neutrality as required under the EU Climate Act. And what does that mean content-wise? Well, a transition plan, according to CSDDD, must contain, inter alia, I'd say, climate change targets for 2030 and beyond. These must be based on scientific evidence, must include absolute emission reduction targets where appropriate, covering scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. And then you should also identify as a business your decarbonization levers, outline the actions you will be taking, explain how you fund all of this, and how you've assigned responsibilities internally. And importantly, CSDDD adds the words through best efforts here. And that emphasizes that the actions that you outline in your transition plan constitute a so-called obligation of means, but not of results. And that's further elaborated on in the recitals of CSDDD, where it's acknowledged that given the whole complexity of climate transitioning, specific circumstances may lead a company to a position where it's not able to fully implement its plan. But that being said, even only through best efforts, I'd say we're talking about a big and serious plan here. And then coming back to your question, Jeroen, like what's this about? Is this new? Well, there are financial regulations already out there that require certain disclosures on alignment with the Paris Agreement. EU is currently pushing for transformation plans in the context of the EU's Industrial Emissions Directive. And then obviously there's CSRD that also refers to transition plans. And under CSRDs, companies that have such a plan must disclose it as a part of their sustainability reporting. And frankly speaking, companies that don't have a plan yet still need to disclose a lot of information under CSRD on climate change related impacts, risk and opportunities. But if you ask me, what's the game changer here? What does CSDDD add to this? It is that it actually requires companies in scope to adopt and put into effect a transition plan that ensures the business model and strategy of the company are compatible with limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Indeed, a bit a new area. Very briefly, do you think that then every company has to contribute itself to this 1.5% reduction, or is this done on a macro level? How is there something to say about that?
Well, well, certainly there will be NGOs that will tell you so, and that is meeting 1.5% and thus a greenhouse gas emission reduction of 55% by 2030 is an individual requirement of each and every company. From a legal perspective, I'm not entirely sure, I'd have to say, and I think it's one of the points we'd have to see progress as more guidance becomes available. And the reason I'm hesitant here is that the 1.5 degrees Celsius requirement stems from the Paris Agreement, and that is a United Nations agreement concluded between countries, and their governments have discretion in how to comply with this requirement. And as a lawyer, I'd like to think that governments thus can make political choices on the targets to be achieved and timelines to be applied in different sectors and industries, as they actually do with a lot of climate-related legislation already. But from that perspective, there may not be a one-size-fits-all approach to being compatible with that requirement to be aligned with limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. That being said, at the end of the day, transition plans are to be adopted by individual companies. And I find it hard to imagine how an individual company, aside from existing legal requirements, but could currently determine itself whether its individual efforts suffice for its government to comply with the Paris Agreement. And if that is what is intended by this careful wording that's used by CSDDD, it will mean that national governments will have to be way more sophisticated and explicit, I'd say, in guiding their industries to Paris Agreement compliance.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. A lawyer's paradise, I would say. Can I go very quickly back to the introduction or the comments by Axel on the interaction about the CSRD and this directive? There's an interesting question. I hadn't thought about this. Is it feasible that a company is under this directive but not under the CSRD? Although the CSRD is 50,000 companies, here only 6,000 companies. It's maybe a technical or legal question, but do you have a comment on that, Axel?
Is it possible? I think it is possible in theory, but it would surprise because the thresholds are a bit not fully aligned. But looking at the thresholds in the CS3D, it would very much surprise me if there would be companies that would meet the CS3D thresholds, but not the CSRD thresholds. I think it's more interesting if you look at it maybe from a group perspective, right? How the CS3D will apply to groups, and you have, of course, the provisions that provide that parents can set up due diligence policies that also can be applied by their subsidiaries, and how that will tie into the CSRD, where, of course, you also have group exemptions with regard to the reporting. So I think there, the more, let's say, complex and interesting questions will arise, but not so much the pure scoping.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that first reflex. Of course, for those that ask the question, this is not yet a legal opinion. It's really a minefield, probably. To move on to another issue, which is very important, and everybody always asks me as well about this on seminars, it's about director liability. If you are on a board, if you are a director, what are my personal obligations, but also my potential liability? A lot has been discussed about that in this directive, but can I move on to Jochen, and can you share with you some thoughts? What does this mean Is it only the member states? Are there EU rules? What are the potential issues there? Can you give us some thoughts about that?
Yeah, sure, Jeroen. I think that's an important one because there's quite some confusion about this topic out there. And that is because the CSDDD proposal actually required member states to ensure that directors take into account human rights, climate change, and environmental matters when fulfilling their duty to act in the best interest of the company. And the proposal even added to that this requirement should be brought in scope of the national laws of the member states on breaches of directors' duties. And then in addition to that, there was this rule on remuneration that we discussed. Directors were explicitly made responsible for putting in place and overseeing the due diligence actions and also for adapting the corporate strategy where needed. All of that and in particularly the debate focusing on the laws on breaches of directors' duties, all of that has met fierce resistance from the member states. It was the council that opted to remove these provisions entirely, and they haven't been included in the final compromise text of CSDDD. So this was, in my view, a big thing that sparked a lot of discussion in the proposal as it was proposed, but is not in the final text of CSDDD. Does that mean that director liability is no topic under CSDDD? Well, at least it's a topic governed by the laws of the member states and not by CSDDD. I'm a Dutch lawyer, so commenting from a Dutch law perspective, the threshold for director liability is, at least under current Dutch case law, very high, and it requires, in essence, a director to have personally acted seriously culpably. And given then the complexity of the energy transition and the many interests to weigh in there, in the interest of the company, I would expect courts to exercise really restraints in judging such decision making by directors. Obviously, from a Dutch law perspective and other jurisdictions, there's more to say about this. But bottom line is, unlike the proposal text, CSDDD lacks a harmonized regime. And it will be the member states' laws here that determine the risks involved.
Okay, no, thank you very much. And a little follow-up question for me. Maybe you meant that already. Clear for directors, board members, national law is what they need to look at and see what their obligations are on the national systems. But what about the liability of the companies that are covered by this instrument? I mean, you are a board member of that company. Does it then not indirectly still come back to you as a board member, or how would you see that?
Well, what CSDDD does introduce is, in fact, next to obviously the existing liability systems in the EU and at the national level, but it does introduce its own liability regime for companies. And in essence, what CSDDD does is asking the member states to ensure that victims of adverse impacts have effective access to justice and to compensations. And member states to that end must lay down rules that govern civil liability of companies for the damages caused to a natural or legal person. And the legal test that is applied there is that the company intentionally or negligently failed to prevent and mitigate such potential adverse impacts. And as a result of that failure, damage has been caused to the natural or legal person. And that in itself is CSDDD's own civil liability regime that made it to the final text and will thus have to be implemented in each and every member state. CSDDD is actually pretty detailed in this respect. It sets out various requirements on the legal remedies that should be available to a claimant, and where a company is found liable, the claimant shall have the right to full compensation, that's the wording used in CS-DDD, for the damages occurs, where reference then is being made to national laws. And thinking of it, I believe another element that is important to our audience today is that CS-DDD also stipulates that a company cannot be held liable if the damage was caused solely by its business partners in its chain of activities. So this is truly about the company itself. And it's an area of law where we may see more and more activity again, I'd say, in the years to come.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for shedding light on that. I will move on to the next question on enforcement, but I wanted to ask Jochen whether after that you can cover a number of questions that are in the Q&A on this climate transition plan. That triggers quite a lot of questions. Maybe you can group them together, but I give you a bit of time to think. So first I would like to ask Axel about the following thing. That there is a provision that foresees national supervision. So at national level, the regulators will overlook this and look their companies. There's probably, this seems to me quite a novelty, but can you say something about this regulatory supervision and the enforcement at national level? How would this work? Thank you.
Yeah, indeed. And indeed, it's correct that the CS3D compliance will also be assessed by what we call a competent authority, a national regulator. And I think that for a lot of companies, this will be a first. They suddenly will have to take into account that they are actually being supervised. And unless you are a listed company or engaged in regulated activities, that's a very new development, which I think will be something that needs to be carefully considered. And indeed, so every country will have to designate its competent authority. Now, some countries, I think, such as Germany, I think there already is a German supervisory entity for the supply chain obligations under local law. In other companies, it may be that a supervisory entity will be appointed that's already engaged in that type of role. For example, because it reviews listed companies, or because it's the competent authority for CSRD compliance. We'll have to really await the national transition plans for that. Now, if you look at the powers of this supervisory authority, they're pretty much in line, I think, with what you see, for example, in the listed entity space or in the regulated activities space. And I think the key principle is that the regulator has the obligation, a statutory obligation, to verify that in-scope companies have the due diligence processes that meet the CSPD requirements. And for that purpose, what can it do? Well, it can request all the information it requires from you to be able to carry out that task, but also it can conduct investigations. In certain cases, it can even carry out inspections. So these powers can go quite far. And what I think is really important here, and I mentioned it a couple of times before, is that there's going to be a lot of transparency about your due diligence processes pursuant through the CSRD disclosure. And what's really important when you talk about enforcement, that the CSRD also foresees that any person will be able to submit a concern to the regulator. And this makes the risk of regulatory action substantially higher. This combination of having this formal notification procedure that anyone can use, and at the same time having a regulator that is required to act, and companies being required to publish so much and so many detailed information on ESG matters. And the question is then, of course, okay, what happens if a regulator would identify deficiencies with your CS3D compliance? And first, I think that's also built on my experience in regulated activities. You would expect the regulator to give you a warning and remediation period. You have this amount of time to fix this deficiency. But then, of course, a lot will depend on the type and of the size of the infractions. And if it's sufficiently serious, then, of course, regulators can also fine you. They can issue penalties. And with regard to the amount of the fines, I think probably a lot of people have already seen it, can be as much as 5% of your worldwide net turnover. So that's incredibly, that can be incredibly significant amounts. So that makes CS3D compliance, again, a very crucial topic. And that's not even talking about reputational damage that can apply when these decisions are made public. Now, from a director perspective, an important question for me will also be, to what extent shareholders may try to hold directors accountable if the company itself is fined or otherwise penalized by the regulator. So I think, in summary, we kind of expect to see a combination of private enforcement by other market participants and stakeholders, and this supervisory enforcement. And I think that both can really influence and inform each other as well.
Thank you very much. Just out of curiosity, do you know already in Belgium which authority will be in charge, or which ministry?
No, and that's if Gauthier has a view. No, the FSMA is the regulator for listed entities and for, in principle, CSRD compliance. So that could make sense. We also sometimes see the federal, the Ministry of Economic Affairs in these kind of matters. Yeah. So my guess would be one of the two.
Maybe a little addition, because the idea of having active roles also by third parties and a regulator is not unique in the EU to the CS treaty, because actually there's also something which happens in the EU deforestation regulation, where also, for instance, based on information that is brought, becomes known through media, or that is brought to the attention of a regulator, it may be necessary to amend the due diligence for that respect. So again, it's something which I find very EU-like, to have this not only value chain, chain of activities approach, but also make sure that actual real-time or new information gets somewhere caught in the process.
Yeah. Maybe thank you very much, both of you. To go back to Jochen, as you see, Jochen, 40% of the questions deal with the climate transition plan, and some rather technical questions as well. I'm not expecting you to be able to say everything, but are there some comments you would like to make if you look at all these questions?
Well, at least it shows it's a topic that is sparking a lot of discussion and debate. Is it an efficient way to focus boards on the implementation of transition plans? And I think apart from the bit on the remuneration and the fact that there is in the recitals and the text of CSDDD this concept of best efforts, I think the requirement itself, and that's why I refer to it as a game changer, to adopt and implement a transition plan, and also the requirements that CSDDD puts in place in respect to such a plan, makes it a very serious part and not to ignore element of CSDDD. So obviously I could think of ways to tie this in more into, I think the wording was here, a more effective way in terms of getting the board involved. But then bear in mind, part of that was in the proposed text and only met fierce political resistance. So bottom line, I think this is a very clear and not to miss requirement under CSDDD, and will be very important for companies going forward. Can I explain then the difference in the wording used between compatible and aligned? And frankly, I cannot. I do see this different wording being used indeed myself as well. I'm not entirely sure that there is an intended difference, but what it does highlight, and that was the point we were just talking about, Jeroen, is that the wording is very careful. And one of the things I'd find very interesting myself is that in order to ensure compliance with the 1.5 degrees Celsius, there's all sorts of rules and regulations already in the EU, such as the ETS, but also up and coming in terms of the RED III. And I'd be keen to see how compliance with those rules compares to what is expected from a company under their transitional plan. There is a question also on financial institutions, I believe, and that is truly Axel's spiel. I'm the industry man, so maybe Axel, you have some views on that, and otherwise you have to revisit me, Jeroen, later on.
If you'll allow me, I'll look at the. I missed that question. Maybe we can proceed with some of the further,
Yeah.
and then I'll answer it later.
That's all right. Maybe I have one other question that comes up in the chat, and I said from the outset we would like to be very practical and operational in the interest of many companies. I see a question from Susanne Haan, who says, what do you think, what kind of departments will actually be engaged in your company? The procurement teams, buy-in? Is there a role for HR on grievance mechanism? Is there something to say by any of you? I mean, the ink is hardly dry of this instrument, but do you have already a feeling who will be involved in the company?
I'll start with the second question, and then gives me time to think about the first one. If you look at the existing practice under business and human rights on the basis of the UNGP, United Nations General Principles, which you could say are the ultimate foundational text that ultimately led to this, although that was not binding per se. But the experience with the grievance mechanisms that I've seen for companies that have abided with the UNGP is usually not use an HR department, but it's really because the grievance mechanism is really about trying to catch complaints or notifications from stakeholders, is that you try to, I don't like the word, I apologize for it, but for lack of a better word, objectify it and take it away from the immediate orbit from the company against whom a complaint is lodged. So I don't think that it is usually so that in other cases, the HR department would be then responsible for the complaints mechanism. Don't say it can't be, but that's the experience that I've seen in UNGP context. When you look at who would be involved in this, and I think it is an extremely relevant question, because indeed you will need procurement, you will need compliance, you will need, I guess, also HR, legal, and you really will need to determine, as on the basis of what I tried to explain at the very beginning, in this mapping exercise, as soon as you start mapping your business relations, as soon as you start mapping what they do, how far your chain of activities goes, and then as soon as you start mapping what the potential impacts are, I think it will go beyond, I think, procurement, because you really will need compliance, legal, you really will need separate committees that look in very much detail, work together with consultants to indeed come to that mapping exercise and come to, I think, what a sensible, as you also indicated, the diligence approach. I think it's really going to be, can I use another word I hate, and then I stop using words I hate, a holistic approach in a company, because it's really something that will require the whole company to sit together to understand the ins and outs by this dedicated group of the company.
Okay, thank you for sharing these ideas. I hope, Susanne, this helps. Maybe just a short question for Jochen as well. The CSDDD is not the only instrument that introduced due diligence requirements. There are others, I guess, maybe more limited. Is there some experience already to share? Are there maybe some things to learn from this, or other comments to make in that context?
Well, I think the most important comment to make there is that the mere fact that your company does not fall within the scope of CSDDD does not mean you shouldn't assess whether your company may be under a requirement to develop some sort of sustainability due diligence under any other legal requirements, because there's quite some out there. And if you briefly run through these, I'd say, first of all, there's other EU-wide due diligence requirements out there already. For instance, in respect of conflict minerals, or very soon on deforestation. Various member states have adopted their own due diligence laws. So there's the German Supply Chain Act that people probably know about, the French Duty of Vigilance Act. There's a law in the Netherlands on child labor, and a more broad bill on corporate sustainability, a similar initiative in Belgium. And I could go on, and there's even in this debate on CSDDD being watered down at an EU level, this discussion on member states looking into means to add to the regime at an EU level their own laws as they have been in place throughout the EU. And then finally, also outside of the EU, there are this type of due diligence requirements out there, most notably in the UK, who have their own Modern Slavery Act, which was actually among one of the first in the sphere of ESG. So the fact that you're not in scope of CSDDD doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't be conducted sustainability due diligence, and that's something to look into.
Yeah, no, I can only echo that, and I think it's also common sense that whether you are in it or out, certain things you simply have to do and take serious. And that is for our private lives the case. It's also publicly. Not everything can be written into rules. Maybe as we come almost at the end, I would like to ask Axel. We have heard all this. There's a lot of work in the pipeline, clearly. We don't want to frighten you. I think we all know that, and we have time to do it. But could you maybe run us again through the next few years? Because someone also asked to repeat again the thresholds. There is a staggered approach over the next few years. It will be very useful if you can go through it again. You have even a slide for that. Wonderful.
Yeah. We will in any event share the slides after the meeting. The next few years. So I think member states for now, the final texts are still to be published, of course, but member states will have 2 years to transpose the text. And I think it's been mentioned a couple of times in this seminar, the devil is often in the details. So the national transposition texts will be very relevant to follow up in your relevant jurisdictions. And indeed, as mentioned, the rules will start to bite in a staggered manner, right? With the first group of companies expected to start to comply from 2027. And I think that's with a turnover of more than 1.5 billion. And then all in-scope companies required to comply from 2029. So that's then the companies with the 450 million thresholds and the 1,000 employees. And what I would like to mention to finalize this part of the seminar is this seems like a long way off, but as discussed a number of times during this session, sustainability due diligence is much more than only the CS3D. It's embedded in the CSRD. It's, if you are thinking about taxonomy alignment, it's embedded in the taxonomy regulation as well. So I think that directors should really be very much aware that sustainability diligence, it's not only CS3D. So don't focus only on the fact whether or not you're in scope of the CS3D. As soon as you're in scope of the CSRD, you will already be asked to report on how you conduct sustainability due diligence, and people will be able to assess you and benchmark you against your peers. So I think that my recommendation to boards is really to not delay setting up these due diligence processes. And I really believe that you can do that in a pragmatic way and try to leverage what you already have. And the first logical step is try to understand as directors, as a board, what is the end goal? What are the compliance thresholds under CS3D, under the CSRD, under taxonomy, if that's relevant for you? And then in the second step, look at what you have in place. Look at your current policies, look at your current contracts, look at your supplier policies, your human rights policies, and benchmark these against those future requirements. And what you can't leverage, then you have to build it from scratch, but at least you'll have identified that. And on that basis, you can really build a plan towards compliance, a plan that you can then action in a next phase. Because then you can start drawing up the new or the updated policies. You can start amending your contracts. You can start to think, okay, what is the governance structure that we're going to put on our due diligence processes? You can start to think about how are we going to set up the reporting lines, because due diligence is going to be applied to the people in the field, which may be your plant at the other end of the world. And I think crucially, you also have to implement this throughout your organization. And that means, first and foremost, maybe training the directors, training the board so that they know what the rules are, what their role is, and what the related risks are. And then also training your people on the ground, because as I mentioned, they will have to apply these rules and actually live these rules in their day-to-day jobs. So I think, as I mentioned a lot of times, the CS3D, but everything relating to sustainability due diligence is really a new reality with new risks. And that's why we indeed recommend that without making people afraid, don't delay getting into action on this point.
Yeah. No, very clear, and very clear. Thank you. And I do share that 2 or 3 years seems a lot of time, but if you calculate it back, it's good to start now and not postpone this. Listen, we are almost over, actually already at the end of this webinar. I just see 1 or 2 questions which maybe the panel wants to say something about it, and then we stop. One question is, what's the impact on non-EU companies as far as obligations and compliance is concerned? It's a question of scope as well, I guess, for Axel. And another question, a bit more broader by Johan Barros. Is there a value, do you see value for independent third-party verification in the due diligence, the auditors or whatever? So maybe the first point, the external side, Axel, I think it is in the directive, but do you want to say something about it?
Yes, and for this seminar, we really focused on EU companies, of course, but non-EU companies can indeed be in scope, depending on whether they meet certain materiality thresholds as regards to the turnover that they generate in the EU. Now, I think the question hinted upon is like, what does it mean for enforcement and supervision? And I think that's indeed a very interesting question, right? If you have companies that generate turnover outside of the EU, how will EU, the regulators, the supervisors that we talked about, how will they apply scrutiny there? And the directive does foresee a mechanism there. If you have a branch, they're going to review the branch. And other than that, they will be reviewed, I think, by the regulator where the most turnover is generated. But to me, the question will be how that works in practice. Like, how will a regulator be able to actually, impose its views on a company whose whole operations are, let's say, in the US? So there, the proof of the pudding is really going to be in the eating. How these the application to non-EU companies will bite in practice.
Understand. Thank you very much. Maybe, I don't know, Jochen, do you want to say something about third partners who can support or help the company in that context, and what kind of help can they provide?
I think in the transition plan and the goals you adopt there will of course be a role for all sorts of third parties involved, like we see in other areas such as SBTI and the like. And similarly, I wouldn't be surprised to see if in the due diligence requirements as well, there will be some sort of third-party confirmation on the quality of the due diligence conducted. So yes, there will be a role, and for emissions, I think it's already somewhat crystallized who are the schemes that provide confidence, and I wouldn't be surprised to see that being applied more broadly.
If I can briefly add, there's actually also in the directive, when looking at, for instance, stakeholder engagement, but also looking at appropriate measures, there's specifically reference to industry initiatives, verification. So maybe not the word verification, but really the possibility also to use experts. So I think there really is a role there, and it may depend on what national authorities will implement, but there's definitely is a role there.
Good. Thank you very, very much. I think we have to wrap up now. Thank you very much to these 3 excellent panelists. Maybe we can give them a virtual clap or a thumbs up. Really very good. Also that you try to stick to the time. I know there's so much more to say about each question, each issue, but that you try to highlight the main points to us. I learned a lot this morning. Thank you as well for the very interesting questions we got on the Q&A function. I've tried, as you have seen, to cover almost all of them. Don't be disappointed if we didn't do it, but I think there is this kind of interaction which is very nice. So thanks again to all of you. Thanks to the participants, and I'm sure we'll talk another day, another moment again about this interesting area. Thanks. Have a nice lunch. Bye-bye.